Hello, lovelies. Not got a lot of time today, as I have a lot of other stuff to do. So, even though you won't see this till my evening, I got tons to do today. So this is going to be a bit disjointed and possibly a little bit quick. I don't know. I've bullet pointed very roughly what I want to say, and I want to go off on a bit of a tangent at the end. So this is Gracie's A Dreaming of My Death, a William Hope Hodgson RPG, which I've already reviewed in PDF form, but now it's back in POG form with its supplement, All Souls Lost. You can get these on PDF or print, but I had to arrange specially to have these imported. And if you remember my review of Gracie's A Dreaming of My Death, you might remember I didn't give it a terribly high score. So why would I go to special lengths to import something that I didn't give a particularly high review score to? We'll get to that. So yeah, this is a game I already reviewed, but I'd caved and bought hard copies despite that lowish score. I got All Souls Lost and the Sardine tin, which are the two things I didn't have before. And you obviously can't really get the Sardine tin in PDF form because it's a three-dimensional object made of metal. So yeah, what do we have here? Well, the Sargasso Sardines, which is just a nice tactile object. When I was a kid in primary school, one of our teachers, her husband, was a heavy smoker of roll-ups and pipes, and he always had the little tobacco tins, which are smaller than this, and we always had a steady supply of them, which were given to the kids to use to keep things in, and so on. Probably that wouldn't be allowed today, I guess, because there was the occasional fragment of tobacco left in them, but it's left me with a deep affection for tins. Somehow. Anyway, what this contains is reference cards. On one side you have a little line art illustration, such as you would have had from the 19th and early 20th century, of various real beasties, but they are used as the basis for some unreal beasties on the other side. So these are basically reference cards for the creatures. So one side you got the image, on the other side you have all the stats. I'm not a huge proponent of cards for tabletop RPGs. I understand some people like to use them for spells and so on, and they can be useful for creatures and things, but for a lot of games where the stats are more complicated, the text on the cards is so tiny that you can't really make out what it is, but they can be useful for keeping track of where things are in the initiative, or not having to lug a whole book if you have a pre-planned adventure set up. So yeah, there's a lot of weird undersea gribblies and fictional or quasi-fictional oddities to be found here as well. But to be honest, I bought it for the tin because I like tins. Anyway, so what is all of this exactly? A brief recap then. I love William Hope Hodgson's work. Now, he was an author of ghost stories, horror stories, and weird stories. His life intersected with that of H.P. Lovecraft. He could have been as big as H.P. Lovecraft. He could have grabbed people's imaginations the same way, I think, if he'd lived a few more years. But unfortunately, he was killed towards the very end of World War One in an artillery attack, and so died tragically young. In many ways, he was an odd duck as an author, William Hope Hodgson, and in many ways the opposite of H.P. Lovecraft, for all that comparisons are kind of inevitable, and H.P. Lovecraft liked his work, loved his work. I love his work. my much neglected Gather Coal stories are an homage and a sort of spiritual sequel to his Carnacki stories, which are about a ghost investigator. Now, I already liked his ghost investigation stories, but what made me really fall in love with them was that one of them was about a hoax, and that cemented it for me that I love his work. He does have that old world Victorian Edwardian style to his writing, which does situate it very, very firmly in that time period, but he doesn't appear to have the same problematic side to him that H.P. Lovecraft does. Not that it matters, but for some people it apparently does matter, so it's worth bringing up. Where Lovecraft was a sort of pale, sickly introvert, Hodgson appears to have been much more of an extrovert. When Hodgson hated something, it wasn't because he feared it so much he kept away from it. It was because he was intimately aware of what he was talking about. Hodgson originally served in the Merchant Marine. So he went to sea for, I think, at least 8 years, probably longer, with training and so on. And he decided he hated the sea. So many of his horror, weird stories are based around the sea, because he was left with a deep and abiding hatred of the sea, having spent years out there. And he brings that experience to his horror, which gives it a different edge to that of Lovecraft. Lovecraft hated things that he didn't really know anything about, and his xenophobia and isolation and his fearfulness bleeds into his writing in a way that is extremely effective. Whereas Hodgson was a much more practically minded man who was into his physical fitness and everything like that. You know, he was very much an action-oriented man who had been out in the world and had experience, and that's why he hated things. So there's a lot of comparisons to be drawn, but they're coming from different places, which lends the two sets of work a very different feel. He also had a science fictional edge to his writing as well, which is interesting, but where Lovecraft kind of leaned into that and built on to it, Hodgson brings it looking backwards into myths and legends and stories, folklore, ghosts, things like that. He brings his eye to that, looking backwards, where Lovecraft was looking forwards. It's hard to explain, but it's good quality work, and so a game based on that work is nice, keeps interest in Hodgson alive. There was also a Carnacki RPG by Marcus Rowland of Forgotten Futures, which you should be able to find online somewhere. He was giving it away for free. So it's not the first William Hub Hodgson RPG, but it's a different focus. For me, it was very much the Carnacki stories that drew me in, but apparently his ghost stories and his sea-based stories are what appeals to a lot of other people. And yeah, like I say, worth a look. I'm rambling, aren't I? This is what happens when I'm rushed and not particularly organised. So yeah, there isn't much to tell you about Gracie's A Dream of My Death, because I already reviewed that. And there isn't a huge amount to tell you about All Souls Lost, because it is a sort of generic expansion supplement. Right? You get a biography of Hodgson. There's some new options for crew, which are characters. There's also rules for ship's dogs, and you could even play one if you wanted. I ran a game of Blood once about a family getting washed up on a remote Scottish island and running into Sawney Bean's descendants. And unfortunately, due to some bad rolls, one of the characters died straight away during the shipwreck, and so the player was forced to play the dog. And it was surprisingly effective. So that's a thing you can do, and that's a thing this game will allow. You often get parts of horror films from the view of a pet. Yeah, often a dog, whether it's the husky in The Thing, or a cat in one of many other films. You know, the dog's eye view. There was a indie film somewhat recently that was all done from the point of view of the dog. Wish I could remember what it was called, but yeah, that's a thing you can do. You've got items and gear expanded. There are lots of randomized tables for inspiration, making this eminently suitable for a single player game. Plus the idea of a ship's log gives you a nice framing device if you're playing solo. There's also some Hodgson style, vaguely scientifically credible excuses for the monsterization of things that you might run into in the Sargasso. So carcinization, become crab, deep sea gigantism, which is a real thing, fungal infections. Of course, we all think of cordyceps because of the cultural dominance of The Last of Us at the moment, but actually sea fungus is, well, at least I find it incredibly interesting anyway, because it doesn't take the forms that we're used to, so you might find some inspiration in real life there. Encrustation, which is when you get covered with barnacles or other invasive growths. You get some more examples of creatures, you get some NPCs. It just rounds out and kind of completes the main book to the point where I kind of wonder why I didn't do a revised core book that puts all this together. Alright, you get some adventure inspiration ideas and a sample adventure, or shanty as they're called, or two in here as well. So it's a perfectly good supplement that rounds out and completes and more fully features the original game. So why pay over the odds to import relatively small indie RPGs and a novelty that probably won't be particularly well used by me, and may never even get this to the table? So why do all that? Well, I like to help in other indie authors. After all, I am an indie author, and I hope that people feel the same way about my material. I'm a fan of long dead William Hope Hodgson, and I want to help promote his old stories to new people. I need to revisit the Project Gutenberg archives of his work and read some more of his stories, and this reminds me to do that. And because review scores don't tell you everything about a game, or its worth, or whether you find it personally resonant or not. And I find this sticks in my brain and keeps randomly surfacing at odd times. And I keep finding myself returning to the episode of Love, Death, Robots, Bad Traveling, with the Thanato crab thing in it. And this is a game that would be able to model that kind of horror experience quite well, I think. And so that keeps surfacing in my brain as well. And the nature of reviews, I think, a lot of reviewers try to embrace too much subjectivity, but a lot of reviews perhaps go too far the other way as well, trying to embrace objectivity. I try to give objective scores, or at least as objective as I can give, right, while leaving the commentary and so on to be subjective. So whatever scores I happen to give this game, it resonated with me in some way, because of Hodgson, because of the media that I'd been consuming, that the game seemed to fit into in a lot of ways. When I give scores, I use the full... I know I've belaboured this point before. I'm going to do it again. When I give scores for style, and I give scores for substance, and I give them from 1 to 5. And 3 is average. Okay? So, and by 3 I mean average. And so at the end of the scores, most games are going to score in that average range, maybe 4, 5, 6. Right? You would expect that because that's the average. Okay, and what we consider to be industry standard is what I consider to be average. So long as a game is vaguely presentable and readable, even if it's possibly too simple, which you could say about this book, although I like the chapbook formatting. Yeah, so long as you can read it and access the information, it's going to get a 3. If there's some sort of style to it and it leans into the style, it might well get a 4. When it comes to substance, so long as there is enough there to play the game, you're usually going to get a 3. But it's if you provide something more, some greater hook or something, that you might get 4 or 5. So I try to be somewhat objective there. Can you use it? What's in it? Style also encompasses some subjectivity because people's tastes in art are different, but like most modern D&D books are going to get a high 3 to a 4 for style, because they are the industry standard, and it's well executed, and it clearly has a strong guiding hand over it, over the artistic style of the whole thing, even though I hate it. That pastel mush. Right? And this game contains a lot of old illustrations, which places it within its time, but maybe it gets knocked down a bit for style because of its oversimplicity, because of its reliance on this older art, which is evocative of the period, but not necessarily evocative of the game. That's my kind of problem with that. But the style and substance is a fairly objective scoring, but it doesn't really convey the whole of the thing. And so this scored previously quite low, but the game still grabbed me. It resonated. It interested me. It kept being on my mind. So some games have this ineffable quality, or resonate in some way with people in a way that isn't necessarily replicable in other people. A lot of people take umbrage with some of my reviews and seem to react emotionally because they have that subjective vibe with some games that they really like. It resonates with them in a way that it simply doesn't with me. And that's something you can't control for in reviews. And that's why my reviews aren't on TikTok as just the numbers and the facial expression. That's why they're here, and why I ramble on about how and why I review things the way I do, why they get the scores that they do. And in this instance, why I was willing to pay out, despite it not scoring hugely highly. All right, and speaking of scores, All Souls Lost. Having the actual physical copy with the beige cardboard cover and the kind of chapbook thing they're going for, it's still fairly simple, but I think the overall style as a physical object is much more effective than the PDFs. And so, style-wise, I think they now get a solid 3 because it feels like an in-world object, and it has the period illustrations. Perhaps more could have been done with layout and font choices to truly create that sort of period feeling, late Victorian, early Edwardian, but it's still readable, usable, all of that jazz. Substance-wise, this makes the original game feel much more complete and extended and expanded. All Souls Lost has 106 pages. Grey Seas has the same. So they're the same size. Weird. This one somehow feels heavier or thicker or something. But yeah, it feels like it completes and rounds out and makes the original game much more fully featured and I would suggest to Mr. Derek Sotek that he do a combined and updated edition, maybe with a bit more attention to the overall style of the presentation, placing it much more in world at the appropriate time. That wouldn't take too much work, and it would just elevate and lift the book somewhat. Substance-wise, then, this, it's an addition, and it provides everything and more that you might want to more fully feature the original RPG. So that's a 4 for substance. So that takes that to a 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5. Still kind of average feeling, but again, Hodgson's work and appreciation of Hodgson's work clearly means a lot to me, makes it resonant. The sardine tin is a lovely object. I don't know how useful it's going to be. I'm not really going to give it a score because it's just stats and cards and images. But I like it. I like it regardless. It's a lovely tactile thing. There you go. I have tons of layout work to do, so I'm going to go and beat my head against the wall until I fall unconscious instead of doing that as a way of extreme procrastination. Zang. There are certain kinds of people, ale-drinking people, people who did a little too much acid in the 60s, people who wear large warm jumpers and take long brisk walks in the countryside. These people maintain that fairies not only exist, but that they are very common. They also tend to believe that fairies are a countryside phenomenon, much like casual cruelty to animals, sexual intercourse with sheep, and having an impenetrable and parochial accent. This is, of course, rather wide of the mark. Fairies have always had a strong relationship with man, darning his socks, cobbling his shoes, cleaning his houses, drowning him, marrying him, and swapping his children for malformed hydrocephalics as a bit of a jape, and otherwise aiding or demeaning the efforts of man. Fairies do not need our belief to exist, they need us and the things that we leave around. Like an urban fox or the aerial rat known as the pigeon, if they survive, they will have adapted to city life and found their niches, not in tending to flowers and trees, but in crashing computers, letting down the tyres on people's cars, and eating leftover pizza. Urban Ferry is a game of those kind of fairies, gone feral and urban, adapted to modern life. It's a comedy game of hijinks, weirdness and strangeness, and it almost runs itself. You want Urban Ferry Pocket Edition, which is revised and updated with better art and edited writing, and it's available from post-mortem.com, DriveThruRPG and lulu.com.